next session.
Great. Thanks so much, James. And thanks everyone for your contributions thus far. With that, we'd like to transition into a panel that's actually taking us into that next conversation of our next steps. How do we translate this into action? And how can we encourage and promote that level of collaboration that we're all discussing here over the course of these 2 days? So with that, our panel is called Towards a Pipeline, Technology, Techniques, and Training. And what we'd like to really do in this session is to explore the technologies, systems, platforms, techniques, and trainings that are needed to scale up the use of computational science and AI to address human trafficking. We'll begin broaching the conversation around what's still needed to effectively build out a pipeline of collaborative solutions that actually work, and create the infrastructure for successful ongoing partnerships between nonprofits working on the ground, tech companies and business writ large, academia, law enforcement, and others. Whether that's developing, deploying, and or implementing programming, or sharing data to create actionable results. And what I'd like to do first is just toss it back to Jessica's question about pointing out that information in terms of victim case management systems and the tools that we're developing, we need to help those to really build off of each other and collaborate rather than compete and duplicate, which I'm fear that we see a lot of in this space currently. And so we're going to be asking our panelists to really discuss those topics. And Phil, I'm looking at you specifically to potentially mention what Tech Against Trafficking is doing on that matter as well. So luckily today, our panelists come from a broad spectrum of backgrounds that will each be able to speak to that in turn. And they'll be speaking to a few very specific interventions, but we'd like to open up the conversation and really broaden it and deepen it for those issues and topics that have really been coming up for all of you in the room. So before I introduce our panelists, what I'd like to do is build off of James's earlier question. We have quite a few individuals from the AI and technical space as well as the human trafficking space, but I'd like to also understand the sectors that we have in the room. So if we could just do a quick show of hands on who's coming from one of the 3 following areas. So I'll list them as you did, James, before I make you raise your hands. But academia, business, and nonprofits. So anyone from the academia? Great, so quite a few. Business. Okay, a few less. And the nonprofit side. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind in terms of partners in the room and how and who we might need more at the table in the future. Great. With that, I will present our panelists who are to my left here. Each of the panelists will be giving around an 8-minute presentation on their intervention of the day, and then we'll be opening it at the end for any questions. If you do have something really pressing pop up in the meantime, we'd love for you to just raise your hand and we'll try to get to it. So the first is Anjali Mazumder from Turing Institute and Carnegie Mellon, and she'll be speaking to Is AI a Silver Bullet? The next is Harry Cook from IOM and the mastermind behind CTDC. And he'll be speaking to common data collection and taxonomy protocols. Phil Bennett, a founding member of Tech Against Trafficking and formerly from Salesforce, will be speaking to how to get the community or the tech community involved. Steve Anning from the British Army will be then speaking to Data Trust, not British Trust, sorry. And then Nadya Bliss at the end here is our discussant from ASU. And with that, I will actually pass it right over to Anjali.
Thank you, Hannah. All right, so I was tasked with, let's see if we can get this to work. There we go. This might take a... So I was tasked with, is AI the silver bullet? This might take a couple.
And for the panelists, where should we be pointing the remote in the room for the slides? Anyone know? Right here. Great, okay, so point right at Emily then. There you go.
All right, here's my answer. This is basically it, right? Done. Just go. So I have to say this is also really hard for me to say because I find it very difficult to say no as someone who got into statistics and the sort of area because I get excited about how we can use statistics to solve problems and problems of societal importance. So to just say blanket no is hard. This. Thank you. And so I have a but. Next. So I thought what I should really be talking about is what can AI offer us? And wanted to end things off of, is there even a silver bullet? And if yes, what might that silver bullet be? Next, please. So I think we should also clarify what we mean by AI. And so I'm using AI here as sort of the all-encompassing sort of statistics, machine learning, data science, computational sort of methods here. And so what I would say is that it does offer an opportunity for us to address some of the persistent questions and challenges that we still have, and to do that in a more innovative manner. And I think it will also offer us the opportunity to make a real dent in this global estimate of over 40 million people that are in slavery, and how we can try to get 9,000 of these people out of slavery each day. And really to create a pathway to justice. So we often think about how AI and other ways of sort of creating pathways to healthcare, and I think this is one way where we can think about pathways to justice. So what I'm going to speak about are what are some of those challenges and what AI can offer or the community can offer. So this was really what yesterday was about. Some of the hothouses, the spotlight showcasing that we had. Sorry, next. So we saw through our hothouses and our showcasing opportunities for how we could actually harness data and use these AI methods to improve our understanding, to address some of these questions at both a strategic and an operational level, so that it can create actionable insights at various levels. And I've sort of given a snapshot here of some of these innovative ways where it's not just using sort of the way that we think of data sometimes in sort of structured form in tables, but using images and satellite images. And the fact that we are also finding ways to create these global estimates using multiple data sources. And the image on the right there is actually a static shot of what is a data visualization tool that's dynamic, which shows the flow of refugees over time. And the different ways that all of these tools can be used to help at a policy level as well as the operational levels. Next. So, what does it offer? And I want us to keep in mind sort of both things, the image on the right, which is courtesy of the Rights Lab, which talked about ways in which AI offers to capture data, to use data proxies, and for data analysis. And so how can we be more innovative in how we measure? So we've talked about definitions, we've talked about efforts that have been extensively done to estimate prevalence, and great efforts already on vulnerability mapping, but the challenges that still persist in that area. So I've also broken this down into the ways that we can use it according to potentially preventing slavery and trafficking, which is understanding the drivers or factors and the pathways to exploitation. And in modeling this and learning about the trajectories or these movements and pathways where we can learn to intervene. So then shifting the needle from the point of just identifying victims or perpetrators, but actually intervening early on. And So what can we do in terms of pursuing? And I think this is where we have seen some of the efforts around how can we use innovative ways to identify victims and perpetrators. And I've sort of used this widely in terms of both those that are recruiters as well as users or abusers, and the activity itself. So if we think about some of the online ads, ways that we're doing, looking at that, the way slavery from space is using satellite imagery, all of these are different approaches to identifying both individuals as well as activity. How can we build decision support systems that then support both from a prediction or risk perspective, or how to allocate resources? Another area that I think sometimes forget about is in building these tools, how can we better support the prosecution side? So in building these tools, ensuring that they are valid, reliable, and admissible to the courts. And can we create innovative ways where we can reduce survivor burden, where survivors are often asked to speak in court about the case circumstances? And are there ways that we can work towards supporting that aspect of it? And even beyond, so we've heard not only including survivors, but are there ways that we can also provide support after the fact? So we're trying to make a dent in this 4,000 or the 9,000 per day, but we've also heard that sadly victims end up back in the exploitation process. And so we want to ensure that we're not only getting people, identifying them, but actually keeping them out. So can we build tools that would help to build resilience to support their survival and giving a voice to them? So doing that, I think from sorry, next slide, is that what we hear is that from an AI perspective, there are several challenges. The data structure is complex, and it is composed of both structured and unstructured data. It can consist of images. It has a spatial component, and I should say there's spatial in the sense of just the distances as well as spatial from a geospatial referencing perspective. There is a temporal element to it, and depending on the data structures too, this can provide another temporal element. So there's also the issue of the scale. So we've sort of heard both things of saying that this is big data. We've also heard that it's small data, and it's both in many ways, right? It's multiple disparate sources of data, often patchy, sparse distributions. Getting into technical terms there, but it's big data in many of its facets as well. So how do we deal with that complex nature is a challenge from a computational perspective as well, a methodological and computational perspective. It's also a challenge on integrating data sources, how we do that. And so there are several tools that we already saw that are being used in terms of anomaly detection, natural language processing, network theory, probabilistic expert systems, but also challenges within that. And I'll include in that causal, there's often an interest and need to make sort of causal inferences, and those causal inferences from observational data that has a spatial temporal process, and in ways where we can't just use experiments. And so I'll just say very briefly that I think what is also an area where we can make efforts is that there are also risks to using AI methods and barriers. One is around data sharing, but there's also opportunities to use privacy methods and to explore the use of privacy methods to sort of support research moving forward in this area. And as it has been raised, to build these safer AI methods in a way that allow us to manage and quantify bias and uncertainty and consider those impacts on our social framework, as well as considering the legal and ethical frameworks that need to come into place. We often fall short on this, and sometimes we think about these consequences after the fact. And so to think about that right at the beginning in order to support it. Next, and I'll finish off. So still a no, but I do want to, so I wanted us, before I get to what the AI community can offer, is there a silver bullet? And if yes, what it is? Final slide. To say that I think we should beware of fast and shiny things, and that there's probably no single silver bullet. There rarely ever is. But if there's anything, it is taking a multi-sector, a multidiscipline approach, coming together in this space, finding ways where we can come together. And what I just offered is that from, I think, our community is that while there's already methods and open source tools that do exist for people to explore and make use of them, we as a community have been working on these methods and working in different spaces across justice, development, security, human rights, and so and health and other areas where I think we can really draw upon that expertise and bring that in. We also have other resources, some of us in organizations that can support the collaboration, opportunities for, so at the Turing Institute, we do data studies, which are sort of like week-long hackathon type things, but with security agencies, with nonprofits, all sorts of things which allow us to bring in people. We also do 12-week internships for groups of people to come together, learn about data science, machine learning methods, and then work on solved problems. Again, other organizations will do things as well in institutions, and just as an opportunity to collaborate and build open tools and resources. So I'll leave it at that, as to say I think we have an opportunity to really make a dent, even if it's not the silver bullet.
Great, thanks so much, Anjali. And I think that there's a couple really interesting takeaways there, including how do we integrate ethical considerations throughout the process? How can we collaborate to ensure that we are being held accountable in the decision making? But also, how can we collaborate with multi-stakeholders to make sure that if it's not a silver bullet, maybe it can get a little closer to being a silver bullet in the future with a lot of stakeholder engagement, should we call it? And then the final item I'd like to just state before passing it over to Harry is, you mentioned that data structure is complicated and that there's a lot of key elements that we need to consider as we're structuring that data. And so, Harry, maybe that helps lead into your conversation today, and you can help us answer that question and perhaps even give people a couple key takeaways about what they really need to understand about data structure as they walk out of the room.
That's a great segue, thank you. Just to start off by saying, I'm not currently aware of any other open data or analytics portal for case management data. We have spoken to a lot of people, but it would be great to talk later and see, because there's a lot of people working in this space, I'm sure. There are people we haven't spoken to. What I'm going to talk about today is talking about trying to establish data standards for the counter-trafficking community. I think also for the wider 8.7 community as well. This is something that others have sort of tried to do in the past a bit, actually, but none have actually really been consolidated and fully adopted. Next slide, please. So for some, this is going to be preaching to the choir. For others, maybe eyes starting to glaze over, but it is very important. So what are data standards? They are basically agreements, documented agreements on representation, format, definition, structuring, transmission, manipulation, and management of data, etc. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, this is the International Standard Industry Classification. You've got, I think, about 21 different industries there. This is used to record all types of, for example, survey data on labor markets, on unemployment, etc. Next slide, please. And within each of those, you've actually got several different layers of disaggregation. It is actually massive. So within manufacturing, you've got, down to the division level, you've got different types of manufacturing. different types of textiles, and then the actual class of good that's produced. Next slide, please. So going back to the obstacles that I've kind of been mentioning in other sessions as well towards data sharing and use, data standards offer quite a lot of, well, they're essential, in fact, to overcoming many of these obstacles. So it's basically a template for combination and interoperability for data held by different organizations. And that can be extremely powerful. I mean, if we're talking about if data we have on where people are exploited, just to stay with the industry example, is able to be integrated into the work that others are doing on economic modeling, for example, or simply, combined with other data sets of their kind, that's obviously extremely important. Once that sort of combination work is done, then obviously you can start to, you have machine-readable data that can actually be, that sort of combination can be automated to feed into the sorts of initiatives that we've been discussing here. Obviously, it's also better for replicability. So you don't need to necessarily go into every organization and ask people what they understand by this term, how they're using this data field, but someone can actually go and replicate what you've done. That obviously helps transparency as well, and of course it's more efficient. What's also important is to have, of course, standards for safe anonymization and sharing. The standards are developed by experts, so that takes a lot of the burden off what other organizations may have to do. And all of this helps to create a culture of greater sort of openness around data sharing as well. It can be a little bit painful to implement, but it's not, I mean, it's certainly not expensive, and something that I think actors in the field should aim towards. Next slide, please. So this is, I mean, basically what we set out to try to do as part of the CTDC project, working first with Polaris, quite different operations in the sense that, so one is Polaris operates the US National Hotline for reporting cases of trafficking, and they have quite a big focus on reporting cases to law enforcement. They're working with the US legal definition. For us, it's face-to-face case management work and provision of assistance by caseworkers in different locations, and a lot of that is with the eventual provision of long-term return and reintegration services. But what was interesting is how much we actually shared in common, and we identified 73 variables for immediate consolidation. Next slide, please. We then did the same thing with Liberty Shared as well, and found that actually mapped on quite well, and we'll be continuing this process as we move on and trying to add more types of data sets. Next slide, please. So that allowed us to get to one single harmonized data set, and of course we can add more partners in the future. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just an example of an outtake of what part of our data dictionary looks like. There's also the catalog there, which goes through all the variables. It's nothing super advanced. Next slide, please. But I think so if we can start to work towards, for example, an ISIC for sex work, so that's sort of what we tried to do. So on the left, you've got sex work broken down into the main types that we come into contact with. I think 90% is prostitution, but the others are increasingly important, particularly the sort of remote sexual services there. And if you've got, maybe half, possibly more of the world's cases of traffic for sexual exploitation, it's incredibly important to be more fine-grained on that, because to develop typologies, etc. So looking at the place of work is one way of trying to have more fine grain on those sorts of typologies. Next slide, please. This is an example, sorry, you can't see all of it because of the desktop, the title there. But basically on the left-hand side, we're looking at means of control. This is the new set of global values that we have. In the middle is IOM's original values, and on the right-hand side, that's Polaris original values. So basically trying to consolidate that into the left-hand column there, and come up with a set of different ways of which people can be controlled. Next slide, please. We're now starting to look at the same for perpetrators, data that we have on perpetrators, how we record route data that victims have been trafficked through, and also country-level aggregate reporting. Next slide, please. So the other key part that we worked on was standards for anonymization and sharing. So obviously we remove all the person identifying, directly identifying hard identifiers from the data set, but we're also reducing the detail significantly for this standard. So grouping age into ranges, for example, mapping location data to larger admin levels. So that type of work, and that all happens before any of the data is shared or we receive any of the information. Once the data are then combined, removing any possible duplicates, then we would then we also k-anonymize it to publish it for download. That's something that we selected after quite a lot of research. Basically, it's a way of removing outliers. Next slide, please. Just a quick example here. So this is the original database on the left, and then on the right you have the sort of k-anonymized, which is to k equals 3. So basically, you're removing all sets with fewer than 2 members, where a set is defined by a unique combination of the different variables you have in the system. So that basically means that you can't query the database and return fewer than k minus 1 cases. In our case, we've chosen k equals 11, which is very high, but we are being very, very cautious, and we would aim to reduce that if possible later. Next slide, please. So that's also why we haven't taken all of this very fine-grained data right now. If you imagine trying to k-anonymize data that's structured like this, you basically don't get anything out the other end. So there's also a bit of a trade-off in terms of what we can expect people to contribute and what we can expect to actually release. Next slide, please. What we've also had to do is change the anonymization for all the different visualizations on the site. I'm nearly finished, sorry. Next slide, please. So here, for example, you've got, as I showed yesterday, the breakdown of the different, some of the main characteristics of people from a particular country. But if you imagine the country was actually a very small country with a very small population of less than 100,000 people, for example, and there had barely been any cases of trafficking reported, then you end up going, for example, so we remove all data when there's fewer than 10 victims here, but then we also apply a population rule to remove the data for small populations. Next slide, please. We're starting to do kind of corridors as well, so it's actually from one country to another, and then you see the breakdown there. So if we're applying the same sort of logic, instead of putting the limit at 10, it should actually be exponential, so it should be 100, because you've got two variables there, basically. Next slide, please. And then this is causing us a huge headache, and if anyone has ideas about this, please let me know. But basically trying to have interactive dashboards where you can drill down and avoiding the possibility of an individual being picked out, but allowing people to interact more with the data is something that we would like to do more of. So we're exploring differential privacy solutions, for example, but they are quite expensive. Next slide, please. And the next one. So I'll leave it at that, just with this slide up on data governance, because I also think it's very important that we have that discussion about what kinds of purposes these data are used for. And I think a lot of that input should also come from survivors as well, and the wider kind of community about how and for what purposes these sort of data can be used in terms of for creating algorithms, etc. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Harry. And quite a lot to digest there. I think that was a definite call for feedback from Harry. So if anyone has ideas on kind of drilling down in those data sets and how we can make sure that we're protecting the privacy of our survivors, that's a big question for the group. I think another question that I'd like to ask, and I'm going to let everyone else kind of gather your thoughts. We have 2 down, 2 to go. So we'll take a moment here for some questions. And I'll start off with a question for Harry, which is really about the standardization and sharing process. I think that in the anonymization process and making sure that this data is not actually giving away key private information, we have the potential to lose data that might be highly needed. Can you speak a little bit to the risk or what we lose in that process and what we need to be ready to consider in the future in order to make sure it's extremely actionable?
We lose a lot, a great deal, but that's kind of tough, you know. I mean, there's no. I mean, previously the availability of the data was effectively zero in many respects. So just being able to put something out is kind of working in baby steps, and then we see what we can release, you know, as we go on. But you know, if you can't take it back once it's out, so it has to proceed like that, and with quite a lot of. You know, quite a lot through basically discourse with experts in the field, with academics. And also I think it's important to see what purposes people actually want to use the data for, because there are ways of releasing, you know, subsets of it or distributions of it for certain purposes. And that's another way, you know, around those sorts of difficulties. So I think as we start to develop a bit more of a template for how these different pieces of the puzzle fit together, and how that actually will translate into policy, you know, actionable results, then we can start trying to prioritize on what we make available.
So are you looking for additional use cases then as well?
Yeah, I think proof of concepts are essential. I mean, we've seen, you know, the work that the Rights Lab is doing. You know, identifying brick kilns is great, but then you also need, you know, to ground truth that, and then also, you know, what is the audience for that work? So being able to look at how we can contribute these different data sets to a more to a bigger picture that's actually ready for uptake by a specific audience. What is that audience going to be as well? Is that actually going to be the local administrative? You know, is that going to be the local government in Nepal, or is it actually going to be the private sector, for example? I mean, anyway, I think that's something that we have to think through more together.
Thanks, Hannah. I have a question for Anjali and Harry, but also for others in a sense. I think we're at quite an important moment in thinking through how we want to build analytical processes and tools on top of two different types of data sets that we have available in this field right now. One is the increasingly impressive case data that Harry has just been showing you, and that's representative of other such case-based data, where because it's often highly structured, we may have a narrower, shorter path to some quite impressive AI, machine learning, other types of applications, and that can also be represented visually at quite a granular level. That's likely to be literally quite attractive to policy actors and to be quite influential and instrumental in their understanding of the nature of populations, affected populations, and of vulnerabilities and risks. But as we talked about at some length yesterday, we also know that data is quite partial and may not be representative. Then we have a different set of data, which perhaps has been less well represented in the discussions over the last 24 hours, which is more about national level surveys and estimations. That's quite different. It's a lot blunter. It's at a lot higher level. Frankly, it's harder to visualize attractively. It's harder to build AI and machine learning tools on, or it may be, and maybe this is where I'm coming to the question, part of the comment. But I think, and as a result, the visual representations we get out of it may be less attractive to policy actors and to funders. But we also know that some of that data, for example, some coming from ILO and other sources, is very methodologically rigorous. So it's a blunt, broad, but strong foundation on which to build. I think we're at an important moment to think about the policy, the resourcing implications of how we do with these two different types of data. And I think there's a real research question for the methodologists and the theorists in the room about how we bridge that gap. Otherwise, I think there is a danger that we start going down one path or another, or worse, we build two quite different systems, two different pipelines, to come back to the question for the session, which are maybe not interoperable, or worse, they're competing for attention and resources. And that really worries me. This is a nascent field. It has political attention right now. That moment can and will pass if resources are not carefully nursed. So the question here really is, how do we bridge that gap between these two sort of data tracks that are emerging? And that's partly an organizational question, but what I'd be really keen to learn from the experts in the room is, at a theoretical, at a modeling level, at an analytical, at a data collection level, how do we bridge that gap? I don't know, maybe Harry or Anjali have responses now, or maybe it's a general question for the room for later.
Well, I'll start at the moment. So I think we need to think about the purpose of why those data were being collected, right? So some of the surveys which are being collected, whether it's estimating prevalence, using a well-grounded sort of sampling method, serves a particular purpose, whereas the case data may be serving a different purpose in use of how we're using that data. So the way that we're using the data that's being collected might be distinct, and so it might still be that we need the different pipelines because they're answering different questions. There is a question, I think, as to how we might integrate those data sources, which is a methodological challenge, because we keep saying it's a hidden problem, it's a hidden population, and so the great efforts of ILO and Walk Free Foundation in using census and survey methods to get at the prevalence still may not be capturing the full extent of the challenge or the situation. And so these other data sources, whether they're coming from cases, whether they're coming from the way that we use satellite image data, or even identifying people online, all of those might be, I think, the next step in sort of thinking about how to integrate those in order to get better estimates of prevalence and the actual scope or scale of the problem. So wasn't a solution there, but I think it's just that we've got a couple of pipelines that might be necessary.
Harry, and then I saw Phil and Nadya also raise their hands.
Yeah, I think it's well. I agree with Anjali. I mean, it's good that the different pipelines exist and that they exist for for a reason. But I mean, so I think what we're trying to do now is prioritize areas where the two can kind of feed into each other a bit, and that's really a case of resources. I mean, for example, as you know, for the global estimates. The case data was used to correct for underreporting of cases of children in the survey data. It was also used to model the proportion of people who were in forced commercial sexual exploitation, which is very hard to collect data for ethically in a survey. I mean, those are just quite... So, I mean, what we see is kind of we have details that you may not be able to get through that type of work that can... help to build a better picture when combined with that type of data. I think it doesn't stop at prevalence data. I have been talking about industry-level data, for example, and how we might be able to even look at, okay, how can we have data on industries for forced labor, child labor, human trafficking, actually speaking to each other on informality, for example, to talk about kind of risk within different sectors or in supply chains, looking at the work that Rights Lab is doing, for example. I mean, that is basically particular industries. If we're able to kind of complement that with data that we have about industries, or if the intuition is correct that the capital intensity of production is actually a key variable there. You know, is that the type of data that we can look at with the satellite data? But all of this takes resources, and it's a case of prioritization, which you know the academic world would do differently to the policy world, and potentially, I think, in many cases. So how do we kind of work together to prioritize a bit what those core areas of work are? Because doing that data integration takes a very long time. It also takes, legal work. So it's a case of trying to, I think, identify some real priorities to get going on there.
Great. And Phil, I believe you had a comment, and then Nadya, and then we'll actually start in on our second round of presentations. So if you had some pressing questions, please jot them down, and we'll come back to them.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Just 20 seconds from me. It's a word of caution, I think, actually. There's a lot of discussion going on now about sort of accumulating data from various places. I've seen a lot of companies in my career. I've been an IT consultant for 20 years, working out how to make best use of data. The most successful organizations that I've seen haven't just had a strategy which is trying to accumulate data and working out what to do with it, producing graphs and analytics. They talk about it the other way. They say, well, what information or insight or signal do we need? What information do we need to derive that? And then what data do we need to do it? And that's a formulation of a strategy. And when you do that, you've also got a business case for funding. And I would possibly encourage people to think about that problem in that way.
Just to kind of second that, I completely agree, because I actually thought there was, so there's an additional source of data that exists in addition to the two that James mentioned. It's the open source data, which also, quite frankly, allows you to prioritize where you can ask those questions and where there's missing information. I also, and maybe Phil can kind of comment on this during his presentation remarks, and this is also a broader comment to Anjali, is I'm very curious as to when you develop a new technology, a new algorithm that you see that it's applicable to this particular challenge, what prevents effective transition? What stops it from being deployed in the field? And we don't have to address all of that right now, but I'd really like that theme to kind of persist through the rest of the talks.
Great. And while we're getting Phil set up, I'm going to let Todd chip in for about 30 seconds. Then we're going to move forward. And I know I see some other hands on there, so keep the questions in your mind.
I just want to echo what Phil said and what James had called, really, it starts with the question. What do you want to know? How are you going to find it out? And how do you know if you're wrong? And the last one is the hardest, right? That's your research design, that's your methodology, and that determines the sort of data you're going to look for. So at the Rights Lab, we're motivated by 4 questions. How many slaves and where are they? What are the drivers for what we see in those data? What works in terms of intervention, and what difference does freedom make? And those 4 main research questions drive our data collection strategy. So if you want to know about brick kilns, that's a kind of where are they, where do we think they are kind of question. So it has a descriptive contribution. But the second order analysis in academia is driven by theory, driven by method, and it drives the sorts of things that we're looking at in terms of empirical relationships between variables that then let us test things like what interventions work, what doesn't work, and gets us into monitoring and evaluation. And finally, if people are being liberated or we address the root causes of slavery, then what does that freedom, what difference does that freedom make? So we have those orienting questions. It's not just a blind strategy of collecting stuff.
And Phil, I hope that sets you up well to dive into your presentation then.
Thank you, Hannah. Great. So this is about getting the tech community involved. I want to talk about actually getting the tech community involved in the most meaningful way possible. There are certain success factors. As a technologist who has quite recently become involved in this space, I'm have hit all the barriers that technologists could hit, I feel, and I want to sort of send a message to technologists, I think, on how to go about this. So I've got about 20 years experience in the IT consulting sector. In 2015, that career trajectory changed. I volunteered on an expedition to Kolkata in India, and it was just a short expedition, 1 week, and it connected me and a group of friends from Salesforce and Google with NGOs tackling sex trafficking, talking with survivors and going to villages to understand the source of the issue. And I came back from that, and I was, like my colleagues and friends, utterly furious and enraged by the barbarity that I'd seen. And my immediate instinct was to try and think, well, how can I science the hell out of this problem, right, using my skills? That was my instinct. And then quickly realized that this snippet of what I'd seen for a week was just the tip of the iceberg, and I really didn't know what I was talking about. So I decided at this point that I would engage as a volunteer. I, in Asia, volunteer with Destiny Foundation in Kolkata. They support survivors of sex trafficking. The next slide, please. So this is my first message to technologists. I think as technologists, we risk becoming a bit distant, right, from the human story. We're sitting in a lab and we're coding or whatever it is we're doing. If you are building technology that is likely to tackle this problem in some way, then you'll be affecting people's behavior, whether it is traffickers, whether it's survivors, whether it is businesses or whatever, which means that this is a human story and you've got to get connected to that. So I've been, I spent 6 months last year in India, and when you build a trust and relationship with an organization, a frontline organization like this, you begin to learn certain insights that honestly you cannot pick up from research papers and textbooks. If you are planning to make a technology intervention of any kind, in my opinion, it's vital to try and connect ourselves into this space. And I understand as a technologist, actually, this isn't easy. You have to make yourself vulnerable in a lot of these types of situations. Heck, I mean, some technologists hate any kind of human interaction, never mind, working in a rural village on a prevention program. So that is, I think, sort of the first thing I wanted to talk about. I think let's just move on to the next slide. Next, yeah, thank you. So this is something which we've just touched on actually in the last sort of 15 minutes, I think. And it's a lot more, it's actually quite complicated to explain. I'm coming at this from having seen a lot of large companies through to seeing a collection of organizations who have a similar goal, configured very differently. And what you see is, from my perspective, technology is beginning to form around and within silos of organizations, often around budgets. And that's fine. Technology is useful in that respect. It provides incremental improvements. But if you're looking for some kind of transformation in, to use your phrase, putting a dent in this problem, actually that's not the most effective way. It doesn't work like that. Technology is an impact multiplier. We need to be, I think, open to the idea that if we want to disrupt trafficking using technology, we might first have to disrupt the way in which we are tackling this problem and use technology for ourselves as well as using technology to actually make a change to this issue. And I would again call out to technologists, particularly technologists who've had experience in other large organizations where they've seen technology employed in different ways, to call this out, not be afraid to disrupt. This is a community of organizations, and I can't remember this there's a modern slavery directory of 2,000 organizations, isn't there? And I'm sure some of those are huge, but this is a large group of people. It's not an easy problem to solve, but we need to start building, I think, pillars of infrastructure to enable collaboration across these entities, information sharing, and some of the things we've been talking about. The analogy I often use actually is, right now it feels to me that we're kind of, as a strategy, dropping rocks in a river, hoping that that's going to stop the river flowing, when actually we want to be building a dam. And technology is a fantastic way of doing that. And when you look at some of the most successful groups of people in the world, who are the largest for-profit companies, they are experts at organizing all of these different capabilities across technology to deliver change at scale. And I think that's what we're going to need to start thinking about if we're really going to start to make a difference. Next slide, please. So as Hannah mentioned, I'm part of a collaboration that Hannah's also a part of called Tech Against Trafficking. Tech Against Trafficking was the result of a collaboration between some large tech companies coming together to see if they could develop strategies to strengthen the way organizations are using technology to tackle this issue. Now, the likes of big tech companies are not experts by themselves. They're not frontline, in terms of tackling trafficking. That's not their subject matter expertise, but they do have significant expertise in using technology intelligently and deploying it in ways that works. And preliminary research has shown from Tech Against Trafficking that right now there's a lot of duplication, as has been mentioned. There's also a lot of tools that have been deployed but are unused. And by the way, that goes back to my first point, is that if you don't consider the human equation of this, doesn't matter how good your tech is, it will be unsuccessful. And so Tech Against Trafficking is thinking, well, how can we sort of help solve these issues? And another problem we've seen is that a large amount of the technology, and probably, I would imagine, a big proportion of the people in this room, are European and North American based. A lot of the technology, and I'm not just talking about AI, I'm talking about a broader set of technology, there's much fewer implementations of tech being used on the front line, particularly in Asia, Africa, South America, and so on, in my experience at least. So what can we do to try and foster and grow capacity in these organizations? And we don't do that just by helicoptering in technologists from other countries and then deploying it and then helicoptering back out again. That does not work. So this is about building capacity in those organizations, developing regional advisors and so on. So the way Tech Against Trafficking is looking to do this is using a concept of technology accelerators. Perhaps a number of you will have come across this term. It's essentially a framework supported with mentors, specialist advisors, usually involving a cohort of organizations who can benefit from technology. And it's a certain timescale of a program which will be used as a cohort to deep dive into a specific aspect of technology, such as perhaps helplines or case management or security or whatever it might be, and strengthen and grow capacity in those areas. And trying to spread the knowledge, which at the moment feels very distorted. And I think that's what we need to look at. So that is what I wanted to talk about. Thank you very much.
Perfect, Phil. I was about to hold up my 1 minute sign, so that was great. So thank you so much for sharing. And I think that's a really key takeaway here, is that there's a bridge to be built between technologists and the nonprofits working on the ground, and that we need to build understanding of the issue, but also empathy and how to engage with these different populations. Technology can't be used in isolation and just dropped off. That's not exactly the best way to set it up for success. And so before we take any questions, I'd love to move over to Steve to help us round out the conversation, and then we'll move forward into a discussion.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So my name is Major Steve Anning. After joining the Army in 2001, I'm now a reservist and a PhD candidate at Southampton University, and I've been working at the modern slavery human trafficking space for about 3 years now. And so today I'm representing a British Army research project in which we seek to develop methodologies to substantiate the risk of modern slavery and conflict. And I think for militaries, this is very much an under-researched area, and I think a recurring theme has been hidden populations, and I think we have a lot of hidden populations there. In this presentation, I'm going to develop, from what Harry said, it's almost as if we planned the panel, and talk about data governance, which I never thought I would do at a United Nations conference. So in this I'm going to talk about data trust, and this is an idea which seeks to facilitate the sharing of data in a trustworthy manner among a community of trusted agents, such as ourselves. So in many ways, it feels like we're pulling through some of the threads from this panel so far. While I don't want to go into specifics, it's probably true to say we're presently having problems around trust around the use of data. So the purpose of data trust, therefore, is to facilitate the sharing of data in a more trustworthy manner. I've only strictly got 8 minutes, so I'll briefly introduce the idea, and you'll see references on the slides, and then my Twitter handle is there. I'll post those on Twitter afterwards so you can see the references should you want to do more reading. But before we begin, to give a focus to the presentation, there's quite a lot of technical jargon in this field, particularly around sort of data governance. So to be clear, For us, when referring to data subjects, I'm focusing on the perpetrators and the survivors of trafficking. And of course, certainly in the cases of forced criminality, a person can be both. And it's the idea of and it's with our common purpose to bring perpetrators to justice and the safeguarding of survivors. So next slide, please. And next one. So Project SOLEBAY. So we're named after HMS SOLEBAY, which is one of the first Royal Navy ships to begin anti-slavery operations following abolition. Our Project SOLEBAY is a research partnership funded by the Defence and Security Accelerator, which is part of the Defence and Science Technology Labs in the UK, and that's essentially the UK's version of DARPA. Within the partnership is the Army and a commercial company called Trilateral Research. So our report is due in May, and we look to publish our methodology as open source in a journal. And I'll post some of our findings on Twitter for those who are interested, and I'll gladly take questions in Q&A. The project is a partnership, and we seek to employ AI to develop the analysis at scale. And of course, successful analysis will depend on having trusted data from a variety of sources, as is true for the many of the technologies we've seen in the hothouses in the last 24 hours. And the key word I've mentioned so far is partnership. And if we look around the room, we can see the people who be part of equivalent partnerships to enable the technologies. And it's no understatement to say we are a diverse bunch of people. And I mean diverse in the sense of our expectations of how data is handled, both from our cultural expectations and our legal obligations, particularly relative to which country we're from. So sharing data between us is subject to our differing expectations, but essential if we are to be successful. So to be successful, we need to have a set of common expectations for how we govern the handling of data for our purpose of bringing perpetrators to justice and the safeguarding of survivors. So next slide, please. So accordingly, the idea of data trusts was introduced in a 2017 report produced by Professor Dame Wendy Hall and Jerome Vicente to tackle this issue. Their report was about developing the AI industry in the UK, and I'm taking a lot of their ideas and applying it to trafficking. So their idea of a data trust was inspired by the legal equivalence in which a trustee holds a property for the benefit of a beneficiary. And while the idea is inspired by the legal model, for various reasons, they don't propose to recreate the same legal frameworks, but it's more about how people give their data to a trusted group of agents and for it to be handled in a beneficial way. So in the words of Hall and Vicente, a data trust is a set of relationships underpinned by a repeatable framework, compliant with stakeholders' obligations to share data in a fair and equitable way. Next slide, please. So since publication of Hall's and Vicente's reports, work to develop the data trust idea has been underway at the UK's Open Data Institute, the ODI. So founded by colleagues of Dame Wendy, Professors Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Shadbolt, who I'm sure you'll all know well. The ODI's purpose is to inspire people to innovate with data, particularly through the use of open data, very much taking similar ideas to what Harry's been doing. And for the purpose of tackling slavery, we might consider what data sets we might be able to publish and where we might be able to publish them. But as we've already discussed, the anonymisation of that data, in the anonymisation of it, we can lose some of the value in that data. So we need to be able to share data at greater risk. So the ODI defines a data trust as a legal structure that provides independent third-party stewardship of data. And to develop their findings, they have recently announced a launch of 2 pilots in the UK around the sharing of government data for smarter cities. So to learn more about data trusts, this is certainly the go-to organisation in the UK. Next slide, please. And to develop the idea further, I'd like to point you towards a recent white paper written by Dr. Kieran O'Hara of Southampton University's Web Science Institute, whose director is Dame Wendy and where I'm a PhD student. So in his paper, Dr. Kieran comments that data trusts constrain behaviours in many of the ways that have been described, relevant to the respective laws and the data standards, but also comments that the benefit of doing so is to liberate data, since if members of a trust are seen as trustworthy, they are more likely to get improved access to data. And that is particularly true of sharing data with government organisations such as law enforcement, and in my case, particularly the military. There is quite reasonably a lot of scepticism around doing that, so we need to do that in a trusted manner, and government agencies need to earn the trust of organisations who develop their own data and made probably personal investment in doing so. So data trusts aren't necessarily about data storage. Instead, they provide a portal to a catalogue of data for sharing between trust members, but data owners retain storage of their data sets. And in that way, it's about getting access to those indirect data sets that have been referred to a number of times, and perhaps unusual data sets in which we might find hidden insights. And it's also not just about privacy and security, that all those are, of course, two important components. Also, agreeing with the ODI's definition I've already mentioned, Dr. Kieran describes a data trust as working within the law for the provision of agreed ethics, a common architecture, and strong governance for trustworthy data processing. And I'll just go over those three components now. So by ethics, we mean that the members of the trust have the competency to understand the data, know how to use it ethically, and are using methodologies that have been agreed by the trust members as best practice. And this is perhaps the unethical use of data where this system hasn't been in place that has created the decline in trust that I mentioned at the start of this presentation. By architectural, we mean having the necessary components in place to create a portal for the various data sets available to trust members. And we've seen many of the architectural components mentioned already, such as the catalogue. And in addition to that are the various tools and visualizations that we've seen in the last 24 hours in the hothouses, and all of which is required to be managed by a governance board. So finally, by governance, we mean having the necessary pre-agreed procedures for handling data, that we have a forum for making policy decisions about data, about our risk approach and our risk for sharing data, and also what happens when something goes wrong. So what does this mean for us in this room? So in the time I've been working on anti-slavery, I've come to realise this, more than any other issue, is one to be solved by multi-agency and international working, for which common expectations are required to enable effective collaboration. So for our data, we have a duty towards protecting the privacy of survivors and providing evidence of high standards of integrity to convict the perpetrators of this crime. So we are an international community with differing expectations of how to handle data and differing ideas of best practice. Yet within the room, we have the enormous potential to tackle modern slavery with our multi-agency and international expertise, along with the leading technologies that we've seen. So without data trust, we would still have the technologies we need, but we in this room would likely be siloed around particular technologies. So having data trust in place would therefore provide a platform for us to collaborate as a community in a trustworthy manner to best serve the needs of tackling this insidious crime. So where we started with the idea of a data trust and data governance, perhaps where we finish is with a means to operationalise this community here today around our common ideas of trustworthy practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that. And I think that really leads us well into a discussion because you're helping tease out a lot of the core kind of questions that are coming out of this panel. And I think that some of the key issues we're seeing here are around, data standardization and aggregation and that building of trust around the usage and safekeeping of data. But also, to Anjali's point, how are we really setting ourselves up for success with the use of some of these prevalent technologies, and specifically AI? And then how are we tapping into the vast amount of resources from these major tech companies? How are we properly onboarding the resources we have in terms of the human capital to help solve this issue? And I'm going to pass it over to Nadya, our discussant for the session, for just a minute to help tie some of these threads together. Oh, yeah, sorry, figure of speech minute, so that she can help tie some of the threads together before we really open it up for discussion. Thanks, Nadya.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I really want to thank all of the presenters, and it's really interesting how this all flowed together. So what I would like to do is kind of base my comments in my own experience. So for the last almost 20 years, I've been working in security and defense focused R&D. And what I've heard here over the last couple days, and particularly today, is sort of very interesting how it fits into the framework of developing essentially a research pipeline. So I'm going to go over some terminology and then kind of frame our panelists into that framework, and then I really would encourage the discussion from everyone else as to how do we really make the pipeline more effective in addressing the on-the-ground challenges. So if we think about how the U.S. Department of Defense invests in research, it has actually very clear definitions of the type of funding mechanisms and essentially a formal definition of a pipeline. So typically research starts out as 6.1, and that's basic research, going into 6.2, which is applied research, and 6.3, which is advanced technology development, and it goes all the way up through to 6.7, which is operational development. What I have found fascinating here, so it was actually really interesting because as I was sitting here, I was kind of writing down where the diversity of panelists fit into that framework. So Anjali talks a lot about 6.1 basic research, and there were discussions about data. Those to me really feed into the 6.2 and 6.3 components, so essentially early stage applied research because you need the data to be able to apply it. And then as we go to tech against trafficking, it really becomes more demo and validation. But overall, I really resonated with a point that Phil actually made about the fact that we are, what was that, rocks in the river? They're throwing rocks in the river? Because if I were to kind of take away from the last 2 days, what I've seen is we have a lot of discussions on, 6.1 and early stage 6.2. And then a lot of discussion on 6.7, which is operational development. And that middle of the pipeline, we have not really formally defined as a community. So what I'd like us to do as a group for the rest of the session is kind of think, how do we operationalize some of those components, the applied research, the early applied research, the advanced tech development. And again, something that resonated quite a bit from what Phil said, which is interesting, because my entire career has been in R&D. So I spent a decade at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, which is a DoD national lab. But the thing that you mentioned about strategy and asking the question, there is a standard set of questions that DARPA uses, the Heilmeyer catechisms, that help you define how to frame a pipeline, which start with basically, what are you trying to do? So that's the first question. The question isn't what research you're going to apply. The question isn't what data set you're going to collect. The question really becomes, what are you trying to do? And what you're trying to do may be elucidate a hidden population, or maybe it was actually, I really loved Anjali's framing, the prevent, pursue, persecute, and support. I thought that was brilliant. Those could be the 4 starting out, what are we trying to do? And then one of the other questions in there's about 7 of them. What are you trying to do? How is it done today? What difference does it make if you succeed? And then the other one that I've really thought quite a bit since James's opening remarks yesterday is we're trying to measure progress. So how do we actually know that we're making progress? And there's a long-term goal of 9,000 a day, but we need to identify, what the Director Heilmeyer called midterm exams. So how do we evaluate that this research is actually contributing? So with that, I'll kind of open up the floor, if that's okay with you, Hannah.
That's a great transition. Any questions for the rooms or comments on that framework? Great. I'm seeing quite a few hands. So, Davina, you've had yours up for a while now, so I will pass to you first.
Well, thank you, panel, for your comments. And Nadya, for your reframing. I think one of the things in response to this question of siloed research tracks and the idea that we're looking at case data or we're looking at national data, I mean, this is something that Walk Free has been struggling with, of course, as we recognize that the national surveys certainly have some gaps in data that we just will not be able to cover adequately. And this is kind of why we're looking at our multiple systems estimation project, and even the integration of multiple sources of national level data is complicated. So then thinking about the scale of individual level case data is very difficult. One thing I would say is that I think we could all agree that the global level of case data for individuals is not at the point yet where it's sufficiently saturated that we could extrapolate reasonably or do a lot of things. So I think the development of these databases, like what Harry's doing, and the further collaboration is a necessary precursor to really meaningfully being able to change to that methodology. The other pieces that I would say, Nadya, towards your reframing, is that I think part of what we're struggling with is in between that area, right? Because we are looking at a very systematic way of identifying, categorizing data, and then meaningfully integrating it. And I think that integration piece is really challenging. I mean, we're seeing that with MSC, we're seeing that with any individual case data we have, and even subpopulation. There's a lot of really interesting subpopulation prevalence work that we still have to find a way to make sense of at a national level. So I appreciate the reframing, and I appreciate where we are, and I think there's a lot to collaborate on. Thanks.
Thanks, Davina. I saw two hands over here. Okay, let's go with you, and then we'll go to you right after. Great.
Thank you. My name is Chandra again. Anjali, thank you so much for your presentation. It is compelling work. I have a question on the data of what you mentioned about pursue. So in this thing, how the integration of survivor look like? It is in the data or not? The second is about prosecute. So in this prosecute, do you work on supply and demand or on the supply only? The second is the element of ally or people that support the trafficking itself. Example, on the labor trafficking side, the agent or the recruitment is the first element that support trafficking. So that's two questions. And how can I see the data in your website? That's the most important. I want to check and study about that. And the second, the question is for Harry Cook. So when you provide the data in this, in this presentation, I have a question again about sex work. So I think that Anjali mentioned about the language. I think we should change the language of sex work, maybe to sex trade or people that engage with sex trade. Because I think we want to give dignity back to people that are affected by trafficking, because sex is not work. Because of there is no such, even though in labor department or wages, that sex will be having a wages or regulation. So I think changing the language is very important on that. Thank you.
And let's take one more and then have the panel respond, and then we'll come to a few of our other questions.
Okay, it's just more of a question and get some clarifications. I recently learned from the GDPR applying to the European Union. For example, this more apply to case data, I think, rather than survey data. When you collect information, you must inform the individuals your intent on what you want to do with the data. And so how are you going to explain to us, a victim, that what AI is? And then you have the law also specifically allow the victim to bar profiling, especially machine profiling. I'm just very curious. I mean, what is the implications on this kind of AI strategy in the future? I think that's it.
Great, thank you so much. So we have quite a few questions there, and I know that, Harry, there was one specific one to you, but any of the panelists that would like to respond?
On language, certainly happy to take advice, and I think that's part of more consultation that needs to be done. I mean, part of the problem is though that there are a number of countries where prostitution is legal. We also don't really have enough data to say which approach is better, I think, in many respects. But regardless of that, we could potentially try to classify this within the existing ISIC framework. I think that's not to everyone's taste, and I think it's also it doesn't really fit as well within that sort of framework. So I think part of the steps that we're taking is trying to develop a new one. I think the language is definitely important, particularly when it's going to be facing different audiences. So this is really a technical document at the moment. It's not really for further audiences, but it would be great to hear your thoughts on how we could better frame the discussion. On GDPR, I think that's exactly I think there are two aspects, well, at least two aspects, but so one is very much about the informed consent at the time that the data is actually collected, and that's the basis upon which IOM operates, and of course that's what GDPR requires, which we're not subject to, but that's something we've had in place. I mean, we've had a policy in place on that since the early, 2010, I think, maybe even before that. So this really does talk specifically about the use of anonymized data for the purposes of evidence building. That being said, obviously, when we're talking about using different algorithms and these kinds of things, different models, I mean, people don't really consent to that necessarily at the point, of data collection and what their data may be used for. I mean, some aid agencies are getting into problems with this now, the fact that they might be using data to exclude certain people. I'm not going to mention any names, but from distribution because there's like potential malfeasance. They're probably not explain that their data will be used to identify malfeasance at the point of collection, for example. Or maybe they are. I'm not. So I don't want to get into any legal issues. But so I think there's a lot of complication there. But I think the sort of data trust, data governance aspect is one good way to try to control for all of that, because it shouldn't necessarily be up to an individual at the point of data collection to be able to have all of the necessary expertise to decide upon those kinds of matters on their own at that time. I think it needs to be part of a more consultative, deliberative process with different actors involved. Just lastly, on the point of prioritization and strategy, that's exactly the point that I was trying to get to. I think we have a lot of things on the table and a lot of different options for what we can do. But I agree for sure that we basically have to just focus on some specific proofs of concept that we think are going to be the most valuable for getting where we want to go, and then try to operationalize those better. That is a bit difficult with the current funding structures, I would say, at times.
Great, and I know Nadya and then Phil had responses as well.
Just really quick to something that both Hannah and James have called upon us in terms of defining a research agenda. Explainability of AI is a really important topic. So that question about what is AI actually doing, and I think in this particular domain where security and privacy are such high priority, making sure that that's something that is getting attention at the early stages, I think is vital. Thank you.
I just wanted to talk very briefly on case data. So based on my experience, and as I think the representative from Annie Cannon's mentioned on day one, actually, which is about issues of re-trafficking. I've met people who've been re-trafficked 3 or 4 times over, say, 10 years, and goodness knows how many non-profits have been engaged with helping her over that time in various different parts. But think about the fact that each one of those was a case, and then often the causes of the re-trafficking was a lack of decent referral mechanism or handover or whatever it might be. Then somebody else, she was then taken out of exploitation somehow by one organisation. That was another case. Then another so there's case data is actually quite complicated, and when we talk about deduplication, that's extremely complicated. That's the first warning on that. Oh, and by the way, just to complete that point, each one of those non-profits adds an impact metric, don't they? Let's talk about that perhaps another time. So then the next one is about sort of when we pull together case data, and look at it, in terms of, well, analysis, in terms of graphs and other things like that. There are also, I think, localized opportunities for AI. So, for example, there are case management services. Liberty Global is one. There's various modern slavery helplines and others, and they are tracking life cycles of cases. So, for example, in a victim case management system, We're capturing information about risks, what the treatment is given to people, what the outcome of that treatment is. Now, it seems to me a fairly, and again, I'm not a statistician or an AI expert, but it seems to me a use case for to be able to send a signal to an overworked caseworker saying that based upon the risks of your clients, it may be that yoga therapy, for example, is a good outcome or a good treatment. And by the way, here is a local yoga therapist who has experience working with survivors. Just sending a signal out is actually quite a useful way of doing it. Similarly, with a helpline, helplines are dealing with dozens of calls every day, very complicated. If there was a signal that can be provided via an AI algorithm that, for example, connected a case with a business or a supply chain or another organization or something like that, that's actually genuinely useful. You're providing a signal. So my ask is not just to think about AI in terms of a process of analysis, but think about it as a way of providing an efficient signal for a next best action to frontline organizations. This is an operational aspect of AI, and I think we should be focusing as much on that as sort of the research-based.
Great, and we'll go to you, Steve, and then we'll come to the corner for your question.
I'd like to respond to what Davina was saying. I think there's something about slavery where it's understanding what is in with our gift to change. And I think the problem of slavery isn't necessarily the scale, so the 40 million, it's that the international system has insufficiently responded since abolition. So the thing we're actually trying to change is the international system to more effectively respond. And I think with the GSI, the government response data is as useful, if not more useful, than the actual prevalence of data in a particular country. So it's choosing the metric that is it within our gift to change is probably a useful approach to have. And talking about the point on GDPR, so in the white paper that I referenced, you can find Dr. Kieran goes through that in a lot more detail. And so GDPR was created for, generally speaking, for web-facing data or web-facing contracts. So you go onto a website, go through terms and conditions, click accept. That's generally speaking what GDPR was created for. But of course, we're dealing with a different kind of use case. Certainly with the case of survivors or victims, we might have to assume consent for a period of time until they know what's going on. And so we're being put in a very, very trusted position to be able to look after that data on their behalf, which is the kind of the purpose of the data trust and having the ethics of that in place, not just the privacy and the security. And of course, with perpetrators, their consent for law enforcement to have their data is irrelevant because they won't get to see that data until disclosure when they get to court. So GDPR does have a role, but I think for what we're talking about, we're coming to much more ethical practices, which Dr. Kieran talks about as a social license, which isn't necessarily based on rules, isn't laws, but it's more on our professional reputation and how we conduct ourselves and the way that lawyers and doctors have that kind of elevated social license to do what they do.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We're going to go to the corner and then to James, and then if we have time.
It switches on immediately. I think I just borrow this share for just 1 second. My name is Claudia Jüch. I represent the Cloudera Foundation, which is a corporate foundation independent of Cloudera, the company which produces software to really manage and analyze big data. And I would like to add a few comments from the perspective of a technological funder. We have been around for a year and a half now, so we are still a very new organization. But I think there are a couple of kind of findings that I've seen in my work coming from a more traditional philanthropic organization such as the Rockefeller Foundation. Kind of how does that translate into kind of the technological funding area? I think the first one is that I want to emphasize comments that have already been made by Phil and Nadya and others in terms of, I think it's really about what do you want to do with the data. That is the first question. I've spoken with about 300 nonprofits to identify the 2 grantees that we have selected at the end of last year. And a lot of nonprofits come to me and say, we are sitting on a wealth of data. That is not good enough. I think it's really about what are the questions that you can't answer now that you feel if you can answer them tomorrow, will really make a difference. And I think that's the question that we get excited about. And that also the data technologists that I have at the foundation who come from the company, I mean, that's really what they want to know. They want to understand kind of what are the signals that you potentially could see in your data that you want to realize. So that's kind of the mindset that they are coming at it, at these challenges. I think the second one is, which has been very interesting to me, is that we need to look much deeper under the hood to understand, is this a good fit in terms of a kind of not only grantee-funder relationship, but also technical partnership, because that's what it is. So we have, with a couple of the kind of organizations, we did like a technical workshop and then didn't select them as grantees, not because we believe their cause has merit, but just we think we can't make a meaningful contribution. And I think that's something for you to think about, because you have a lot more technologies to choose from. So how do you really kind of make sure that the technical fit is there? And I think the third piece that I want to add, maybe building on Harry Cook's comments as well. So the first set of grants that we have made are now 3-year grants, and it feels to me that that's at least how long these organizations will need to be able potentially to sustain these solutions and to build the capacity alongside. I'm still not sure whether they will really be, kind of be at the end of that time, be in that space, given where they are starting out from. So one thing that I'm looking into is kind of how can you build hubs, because data engineering and data science capacity will be hard to sustain for a lot of organizations, and how can you have shared resources in this case? Thank you.
Thanks so much for the comments. James, over to you.
Thanks. I think my comments actually connect quite nicely to this. I wanted to bring this discussion of what's the research question or strategic objective also back to the context we're sitting in, which is an intergovernmental environment. We do have several policy actors from different states in the room and potentially watching. And just talk about, for a second, the role of states in this as well. In one sense, we have a big, clear strategic objective already set out for us in Target 8.7. Target 8.7 commits over 190 states to take effective measures to end modern slavery, et cetera, et cetera. The commitment is not to end it by 2030, it's by 2030 to take effective measures. So the question from the perspective of member states is, what's an effective measure to end modern slavery, et cetera? So that's a big strategic objective. That doesn't give you a strategy, though. Strategy is all about hard choices when you have scarce resources and picking ways, pooling resources, as Claudia was saying, and so on. And there, I think we need to be really, sorry, Davina, but we need to be very undiplomatic and very straightforward and say, the reality is that after several years of conversation, we have no shared strategy in this field. We've had several efforts at developing organisations, such as Alliance 8.7, that are moving us in that direction. The call to action that the UK engineered and now has well over 70 member states, including some perhaps not obvious suspects, such as China and Saudi Arabia, signed up, also sets out a list of what you might call strategic sub-objectives. But it's not a strategy. So instead, how is strategy developed in this field? It's developed by the uncoordinated mobilization and allocation of resources. And the reality is that big new entrants to this field, like the Global Fund, are going to, through their choices, create a magnetic polarity in this field that all of the funding takers and norm takers will be aligned to. So what's interesting about this discussion is we're now talking about bringing in a new set of players, in particular tech organizations and tech funders, that either could make that even messier or could run a jolt of electricity through this soup and help give it a little bit more structure and organization. And there's a possibility here, I think, to think about how we can use that opportunity to bring more structure to the strategic discussion. States are central to that, not only as funders, but also in the way they're creating other forms of demand for data. Look, for example, at the role of transparency legislation in the UK, now in Australia, potentially in Canada, possibly in Norway. Also the mandatory due diligence laws we see coming in France, possibly in a year or two in Germany, maybe in Switzerland. These are all creating use cases for data that are going to drive a lot of these actors in this room choice. Sorry, Hannah. So a key point there, I think we really need to think about how we organize to develop strategy. And a second point, which I'll be much more brief about, we need to do that for tomorrow, not just for today. The Special Rapporteur's next and final report will be on the drivers of slavery and how that's changing slavery, how the automation of work, demographic trends, environmental trends are creating new drivers of slavery. My team at UNU will be helping with some background research for that. If anybody wants to be part of that or talk to us about that, we'd love to hear from you. Sorry to take up so much time, Hannah.
No, I think that was actually a fantastic close. I'm sorry to say that we're at time. I saw a lot of interested hands going up. So our panelists right here, they will be here all day and through lunch. And so I just encourage everyone to take these conversations and this interest in this topic, coordinating moving forward into your discussions over lunch and through the rest of the day. Thanks so much.
May I add one housekeeping note? If you have until 1:30, we'll resume at 1:30. If you do intend to leave the UN grounds during that time in search of food, please keep your pass. You'll need that pass to come back in. You don't need to leave the grounds to find food. There's some right out here. If that gets overcrowded now, there's another little cafe upstairs or back down along the corridor through the rotating doors. Enjoy your lunch and we'll see you again at 1:30.
So